on the ground. President Donald Trump visits Kenosha, Wisconsin, site of several days of protests and riots. Coronavirus crisis, new developments in the search for a vaccine. And the eye in baptism, why a recent decree from the Vatican held special meeting for a Catholic priest in Detroit. And the Spirit drives them, how one priest in Colombia celebrated Mass during the COVID-19 pandemic, on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, September 1st, 2020. Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Eric Rosales in for Tracy Sable. President Donald Trump tours the damage in Kenosha, Wisconsin, one of the cities at the center of racial unrest. Violent protests erupted after a white police officer shot a black suspect 7 times, leaving him paralyzed. Investigators say Jacob Blake was fighting with officers and then trying to get into his car, where they say they found a knife on the floor, the rampage that left 2 people dead. White House correspondent Owen Jensen begins our team coverage. Owen.
Eric, when President Trump arrived in Kenosha, Wisconsin this afternoon, he met with law enforcement, thanking them for their work in helping quell that situation. And he also said the minute the National Guard arrived on scene, it was pretty much over.
This is going to heal very quickly. We're going to help them from an economic standpoint, and we're going to make a contribution to your law and to what we call law and order. Some people think those are 2 terrible words, law and order, and they're not terrible at all. They're beautiful. They have to be used judiciously. They have to be used properly.
President Trump also toured the destruction today in Kenosha. It's in the millions of dollars. Public property, businesses, car lots, some went up in flames. Quieter now, thankfully. Time to heal and rebuild. The president also said these are not acts of peaceful protest, but domestic terror.
We're going to be helping you with law enforcement. We're going to be helping you with some economic development. Get it back in shape. Get Kenosha back in shape, and we'll get it back in, I think, very quickly.
Now, to be clear, not all were happy to see the president in Kenosha today. Some today jeered, others cheered. A plane, by the way, pulling a sign read, look up there, it says, "Reject Trump's violence, vote November," in the election right around the corner, of course. Things calmer again, but a curfew does remain in effect in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Also tonight, the president said that $1 million will be going towards police there, that $4 million will go to small businesses, help them rebuild, and public safety will get $42 million. And we're also learning tonight that the Biden team is considering paying a visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin. Eric?
White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting tonight. Thanks, Owen. So what's it like in Kenosha right now? Let's check in with Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press. Philip, welcome back. And we know that President Trump is there. Describe the scene and the mood today.
Well, this was a very tightly controlled visit from the president, and he got pretty much exactly what he wanted out of this. We were expecting a visit to some of the destruction, as you can see behind me, and he did do that, visited one shop that had been looted and burnt down, and then he went in for a relatively long roundtable discussion with law enforcement, police officers, but also the National Guard, of course, that were called in here by the Democratic governor of Wisconsin. Essentially, the president was able to do what he wanted here in terms of showing a message of law and order. You've heard him say this before. It's turning very much into one of the tenets of his campaign, that he is the one who can bring peace to a city like this one, and that a potential presidency of Joe Biden would bring more of that destruction that Kenosha saw over the last week. That at least was the message coming from the president here in Kenosha today.
Well, Philip, we actually see some of the damage there over your shoulder, and the city-owned property is estimated the damage is at $2 million so far. Talk a little bit about what the community has gone through.
Well, it's been a very tough week or so for people here. It's been a very violent few days. The last few days have been quiet, luckily enough. But remember that Jacob Blake was shot by police, and then 2 protesters were shot by a 17-year-old in the protests that came thereafter. And the feeling that you get here is that this is a community that somehow wants to heal. Remember, that was the reason given by the Democratic governor of the state of Wisconsin for the president not to come here. He sent the president a letter imploring him not to do this visit in the end. Now, in the end, the president, though, was greeted by, as he usually is, a few hundred supporters, but among them more protesters than we are used to from a presidential visit. The city of Kenosha, after all, is divided pretty much straight down the line between Republicans and Democrats. It's essentially a swing city within a swing district within the swing state of Wisconsin. Big divisions here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it certainly is a swing state, and it's also a key battle state in the upcoming election. President Trump was there today. Do we know if Vice President Joe Biden plans to visit there as well?
Well, it's likely that at some point he's going to come to Wisconsin, not necessarily to Kenosha. Essentially what we've heard from the former vice president is that he doesn't want to get in the way of the healing, which is precisely, of course, what we heard from the governor of the state, that he doesn't want any visits right now. So I think the former vice president will be waiting on the sidelines before any visit to this specific city happens. Now, Wisconsin, of course, has to be on his itinerary, because if you want to win the presidency, well, you have to go to Wisconsin, of course, which Hillary Clinton, of course, didn't manage to do in 2016. This was the state, one of the three states that so surprised everybody and was won by such a small margin by Donald Trump in 2016. He, of course, wants to repeat that in 2020, and that might, of course, be one of the reasons why he wanted to come to Kenosha so quickly. The president, it is likely, sees this not just as a presidential visit, but as a bit of a campaign visit as well.
Certainly that. Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press. Thank you very much, Philip. Well, on Capitol Hill, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin was in the hot seat answering questions from lawmakers investigating the federal response to the coronavirus pandemic.
The president and I want to move forward with more fiscal response. And let me just say, the expiration of enhanced unemployment insurance is something that we are concerned about. I believe that Republicans and Democrats need to work together to have additional support.
You may recall President Trump attempted to bypass Congress by taking executive action, but some of those programs are not working as quickly as the president had hoped for. Syria claims Israeli airstrikes killed 2 soldiers last night. 7 others were injured. People in Damascus say that they heard explosions in the sky. Israel reportedly targeted Iranian positions south of the city. Israel views Iran as a regional menace and has promised to stop any Iranian buildup in Syria. Well, the president of France returns to Beirut, marking 100 years since Lebanon gained independence. Emmanuel Macron arrived at the presidential palace today, and he was met with Lebanon's Christian president. Macron is in Beirut to help the country recover from the spiraling economic crisis, along with the aftermath of that massive blast that killed nearly 190 people. A peace deal in Sudan. Rebels and government officials sign a peace agreement after months of negotiations. The deal gives some southern provinces limited independence, and some of the rebels will be integrated into Sudan's army. The Australian government appointed a new ambassador to the Holy See. Ambassador Porro met with Pope Francis last Thursday. She presented her credentials, and she is the country's 4th resident ambassador since 2008. At 36 years young, that is, she is one of the youngest ambassadors to the Holy See, and she brings plenty of experience in foreign affairs from her previous jobs in both India and Africa. Joining us now is Ambassador Porro, Australian ambassador to the Holy See. Ambassador Porro, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about your role as ambassador to the Vatican and what you hope to achieve?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm very pleased to have arrived here in Rome and taken up my functions as Australian Ambassador to the Holy See. As the only ambassador resident here in Rome from the Pacific region, I really hope to be able to represent our region, bring more of a Pacific voice here in Rome, and talk about some of the things that Australia is doing in our region, particularly on issues such as the environment and also in terms of elevating the role of the church in the Pacific, which plays a really critical role in terms of the community there.
Exactly, and some of the other issues that you want to advance also on the agenda are human rights and conflict resolution and peace building, correct?
Sure, yeah. So we work very closely with the Holy See on our multilateral agenda, and human rights is very important for Australia. We're just about to conclude our term on the UN Human Rights Council, where we've made a lot of progress. And of course, we're very active in the United Nations in New York and Geneva. And again, there we try to bring the Pacific voice and working with our counterparts here at the Holy See to advance our joint objectives, including on issues such as human trafficking and modern slavery, which Australia is very, very active on.
And I understand last week you had a very special visit with the Holy Father. What did he say and what advice did he give you?
I was very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to meet with the Holy Father. We had a long discussion. He was very generous with his time. And we discussed a wide range of issues. I was very keen, again, to promote what Australia has done, our region. He's very interested in our region. He hasn't visited there yet. There was a trip planned for this year, but it has unfortunately had to be postponed. So we discussed that. We also discussed youth and outreach to youth. In my opinion, youth are really the future of the church. And I think it's very important to be able to engage with youth all across the world. I hope in my role as a relatively young ambassador to be able to act as a bit of a bridge, for the younger population. But of course, taking into account all the experience and wisdom of the older generations who obviously have a lot to offer.
You definitely do have a lot to offer, and you recently wrote that this year will mark the 10th anniversary of the canonization of St. Mary MacKillop, Australia's first canonized saint. And how will the embassy be marking this milestone?
Well, for us, I was very lucky to be able to present the Holy Father with a relic of Mary MacKillop, and I really wanted to do this for a number of reasons. I know the Global Compact of Education is a real initiative of Pope Francis, and Mary MacKillop was very active on helping the poorer part of the population in Australia to have access to education. She set up schools in the rural areas of Australia, and so I think her actions, her life, are very, very important to remember during these times. Also, during these times of coronavirus, Mary MacKillop did not have an easy life. She spent several periods in isolation, and she fought through and really symbolises the character and spirit of Australia. So I was very, very keen to speak with the Holy Father about this very important person for Australia. We will, of course, with coronavirus, we're still figuring out how we're going to mark the occasion in October, but we'll be working very closely with various stakeholders back in Australia to promote this very significant anniversary for us.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Porro, Australian Ambassador to the Holy See. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, new developments in the search for a vaccine for COVID-19. The economy in India is in free fall and unemployment is soaring after over 1 billion people were forced into lockdown. Many states in India are easing restrictions, allowing more businesses to reopen. But India's coronavirus is the world's fastest growing and has the highest single-day load in the world. Infections in India are expected to soon pass Brazil. In Hong Kong, thousands are being checked in a mass testing program, but experts say just because people are being tested doesn't mean that they can travel freely.
After this mass testing, these people are not safe. They just cannot go everywhere.
People began lining up at testing centers in Hong Kong today. Over 100 were set up throughout the city. Cases of COVID-19 have been dropping in Hong Kong, but officials say it still cannot trace about 30% of infections. Israel is calling in the army to help with the virus. The military is setting up a new task force, and it will play a major role in contact tracing. The army commander in charge says that he's used to dealing with fighting terrorists, but this operation is on a, quote, different scale. Well, the head of the FDA says that it may consider allowing a coronavirus vaccine to be put on the market before finishing phase 3 clinical trials. Health experts are now weighing in. Correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Eric, more than 6 million Americans have been diagnosed with COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. More than 183,000 people have died. And as the virus continues to spread around the world, the race is on to develop a vaccine. One Catholic healthcare professional tells me she is cautiously optimistic.
The world waits for a vaccine.
The FDA is willing to at least look at expediting that process. They haven't guaranteed that they will. They want to look at the data to see whether it's reasonable to do so, but I think that's encouraging.
Dr. Barbara Golder with the Catholic Medical Association says the news from the FDA shows signs of working toward the common good of society.
I think from a Catholic perspective, that makes a lot of sense.
In the U.S., 2 vaccines are currently in phase 3 clinical trials, the step that determines whether a vaccine is effective and safe or not. Now, the head of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Stephen Hahn, says the agency may allow drug makers to put those vaccines on the market before finishing clinical trials. In an interview with the Financial Times, Hahn said the FDA might be willing to grant an emergency use authorization or even an approval if a vaccine maker applies for one and if the FDA agrees. But there could be another challenge drug makers and health experts will both face. Concerns from those taking the vaccine about the possibility of side effects. A recent CNN poll shows that 40% of Americans say they wouldn't get a vaccine even if it was available.
And so the decision about taking the vaccine, when to take it, is something that people have to make with their own physicians. But I think it is important that we make the vaccine available early on to people in the high-risk groups, both caregivers and people with medical conditions who need it, because those are the ones who are going to be most affected.
Dr. Golder also says this is a good time to invest in ethical vaccine research that would not rely on the cells of aborted babies. She says we can lobby for other options when looking for a solution. Eric?
Correspondent Mark Irons reporting tonight. Thanks, Mark. Up next, Pope Francis says caring for planet Earth is his prayer intention for September. And a Catholic priest in Colombia celebrates a unique Mass. We'll explain. Tonight we take a look at an incredible story of Father Matthew Hood, a Michigan priest who recently discovered through watching old family videos that his baptism was invalid.
When the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith came out with their statement on the words for baptism, they clearly said that the words "we baptize you" is not valid. So I found out that I was never validly baptized, which means if baptism is the gateway to the sacraments, that all of my other sacraments were invalid as well. So I needed to receive all of them.
Well, as you heard, Father Hood has since been validly baptized, confirmed, and ordained. Now, joining me now with more on the story is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, thanks for joining us. Good to see you again.
Always a pleasure.
This is an incredible story. As soon as Father Hood saw the video and he heard the word "we know that something was wrong, but some of our viewers might not understand what the problem was. Can you explain it for us?
Surely. I mean, this is the thing about the sacraments, is they depend for their validity on certain criteria that the Church lays out in its teaching, matter and form, basically what you do and what you do it with and how you say it and how you do it. Now, in this case, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued this clarification in July saying that you can't say "we baptize you" in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You have to say "I." And they made a number of theological reflections on why this was so important. They talked about the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. They talked about the teachings of the Council of Trent. They talked a lot about the Scriptures. And to say that really the Church teaches that the act of baptism is an individual act. It's a one-on-one encounter between the minister of the sacrament through whom Christ is acting and the person receiving the sacrament of baptism. So it's not possible for it to be a sort of joint effort, if you like. And at the same time, to say "we baptize you" is, if you like, not just stepping outside the Church's criteria, but it's stepping away from the Church's teaching.
And Father Hood has since received his sacraments and been ordained. And what's he been dealing like personally?
I imagine this has been an extremely confusing and difficult time for Father Hood. But certainly in all of the interviews that he's given, including to us at CNA, he's been a model of exactly what you'd expect, which is faith, that this is something that he has dealt with in, I think, an exemplary way. The thing he told us was, God is not a liar. that just because he turned out that his baptism in 1990 wasn't valid, and therefore neither of his other sacraments, including confirmation and ordination, that this didn't mean he'd never had a relationship with God, that he'd never had a relationship with the Holy Spirit. On the contrary, that he'd been receiving clearly graces throughout his entire life, which has sustained him and got him where he was, and also sustained him through this time.
And what are the implications for Catholics who received the sacraments from fatherhood before his baptism was valid?
Well, the simple fact is, if you're not a priest, there are certain things you can't do. You can't forgive sins sacramentally. You can't celebrate the Eucharist validly. You can't confirm people. So these are all things that fatherhood has presumably been doing during his 3 years when he thought he was a priest. And in many cases, many Catholics will have to go and get those sacraments repeated. But of course, unlike his own original attempted baptism, the baptisms that fatherhood has performed over the years are certainly valid. Because, of course, anyone can baptize validly, provided they use the right words.
And for those who have questions, should they talk to their local priest, things like that?
Absolutely, but I think it's important that Catholics not succumb to a kind of council of paranoia here. Fatherhood's case is exceptional, and it is exactly that. It's an exception. Certainly, if you were baptized in that parish by the permanent deacon in question during those years, you might have reason to suspect something needs to be looked into. But I think in general, the Church and Catholics more generally should presume in the wisdom of the Church and the validity of their sacraments, and not try to make the exception into the rule.
Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Catholic News Agency, thank you so much. Very interesting story.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Pope Francis releases his prayer intention for the month of September, and he's asking for a greater respect for planet Earth.
Los bienes del planeta, exprimiéndolos.
The Holy Father says the planet's resources are being squeezed like an orange, and he calls it an ecological crisis, and he's urging countries and businesses to stop exploiting natural resources. Finally tonight, listen to this. Colombia remains in a strict lockdown because of the coronavirus pandemic, but that didn't stop one priest near the capital of Bogotá from celebrating Mass.
La gracia de nuestro Señor Jesucristo, el amor del Padre.
Well, the Mass was celebrated at a drive-in theater. Now, the idea came from the theater's owners. Attendees remain in their cars and near their cars. To keep social distancing, the Mass was shown on a giant screen behind Father Luis Carlos Ayala. One attendee said that the service was a reminder that we are far away, but also that we are together. Well, we want to thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Eric Rosales. Have a wonderful night, and God bless.